Community-centered, community-supported. Alaska Public Media. Alaska Insight is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers just like you. Thank you.
Low oil prices are creating holes in Alaska's budget, making conversations around funding education and state services even more difficult.
Transportation costs, health insurance costs. Districts are really needing an infusion of money that we have not been funding the last several years.
How can legislators balance the budget to meet the obligations to fund services? We'll discuss it right now on Alaska Insight. Good evening. Business is picking up in the state legislature right now as Alaska's operating budget comes closer to completion. Tonight we'll speak with members of the state Senate about their ideas for addressing the state's fiscal issues, primarily how to maintain funding for important state services while passing the constitutionally obligated balanced budget. But before we get to that discussion, we'll start off with some of the top stories of the week from Alaska Public Media's collaborative statewide news network. In Congress on Tuesday, the day after a Nashville school shooting, Alaska Congresswoman Mary Peltola reiterated her support for the Second Amendment at a House hearing. She commended responsible gun owners and hunters. She referred only obliquely to the Nashville killings and said such tragedies aren't committed by hunters who learned good values at home. Her position disappoints a segment of her Democratic base who want her to support a ban on AR-15 style weapons. A federal judge could issue a decision as early as next week on whether to temporarily halt construction of Willow, ConocoPhillips' controversial oil drilling project in the National Petroleum Reserve. Two lawsuits filed by environmental groups and an Inupiat advocacy organization aim to overturn the Biden administration's approval of Willow. The plaintiffs have asked for an injunction to halt construction until the case is decided. U.S. District Court Judge Sharon Gleason says she will try to have a decision on the injunction by April 3rd. In 2021, Alaska reported its highest number of pregnancy-associated deaths in the last decade, more than double the most recent 5-year average. Those statistics come from the state's Maternal Child Death Review program, which looks at deaths that happen from the start of pregnancy until 1 year after a pregnancy ends. The report finds most of these deaths in Alaska do not happen during labor, but rather from violence afterwards. More than half of the maternal deaths in the last 5 years were linked to intimate partner violence. Advocacy groups, as well as those involved with the program, say the numbers are a call to action for Alaska to address its longtime issues with violence against women. You can find the full versions of these stories and many more on our website, alaskapublic.org, or by downloading the Alaska Public Media app on your phone. Now, on to our discussion for this evening. The Alaska Legislature is more than halfway through its regular session, and as with many recent sessions, discussions largely center on the state's finances, while a number of social issues have come up as well. Alaska Public Media's Kavitha George has this report on what to watch this session.
The legislature's primary job each year is to pass the state budget. Alaska's budget outlook is heavily dependent on the price of oil, and this year, dropping oil prices have created a pretty big hole. Last week, the Department of Revenue released new estimates that show the state has about $245 million less than expected in revenue this year. The legislature will likely have to spend from savings to cover that gap, and both the House and Senate are considering smaller PFDs this year, ranging from $1,300 to $2,700. Even Governor Mike Dunleavy, who was in favor of a $3,700 dividend this year, acknowledged it may have to be a smaller amount.
And we'll continue to have the discussions as to what that's going to look like in the end. In the end, it's the legislature appropriates, so we'll see what that number lands on.
The deficit estimate doesn't include the proposed increase to education funding, another big issue lawmakers are working through this session. Both the House and Senate are advancing bills to raise the base student allocation, or the amount the state pays K-12 schools per student enrolled. Juneau Representative Andy Story stressed that between flat funding education and historic inflation, schools have been working with tighter and tighter budgets.
Transportation costs, health insurance costs, districts are really needing an infusion of money that we have not been funding the last several years.
Last week, the House Education Committee whittled down the proposed BSA increase over the next 2 years from over $1,300 to $800. Another priority for some lawmakers this session is moving state employees back to a defined benefits pension system. Reports show most employees aren't able to save enough to retire under the current 401k style system. Senator Kathy Giessel, who championed the bill in the Senate, says it's a driver of Alaska's labor shortage.
We have ferries right now that are ready to sail, but they can't sail because there's not enough crews to staff them. We have schools that started this fall without a teacher in every classroom. We had kids and parents not sure how those kids would get to school this year because buses were not fully staffed with qualified bus drivers.
As the session approaches its final weeks, the budget outlook is going to create some tough choices for lawmakers trying to push their priority bills forward. A few have floated reducing oil tax credits or even introducing a sales tax as a way to boost revenue. But both ideas are a long way from passing. For Alaska Insight, I'm Kavitha George.
Joining me tonight to discuss what's happening in Juneau, particularly in the state Senate, is Senate President, Kodiak Republican Senator Gary Stevens, and Senator Bill Wielechowski, an Anchorage Democrat and chair of the Senate Rules Committee. Welcome, both of you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So I want to find out about a meeting that happened this morning. Senator Stevens, the governor requested meeting with Senate leadership this morning. What can you tell us about this meeting?
Well, I asked the governor if he would meet with us, and he wasn't able to come to a session we had yesterday, but he was able to organize an 8 a.m. meeting with our caucus, which was really valuable. I think we had a chance to hear what the governor's concerns are and that he's willing to work with us. And so it's very positive, I think, in many ways. He has some interesting ideas. And of course, all the things that we talked about are things that the Senate has been working on and various elements of the Senate, mostly in finance. So, it was a good meeting and brought us all together. And I'm pleased to see the governor is being so positive about helping us to move forward and come up with a final solution here.
Did you talk in specifics about some of the proposals that are presented, such as the tax bills that are being looked at right now?
Well, I think what the governor said pretty much is that he's willing to listen to anything that gets us to the end and solves the problems we face. The big issue, I think, of course, that is out there that we need to decide upon is the amount of the PFD and how we're going to fund the budget. There are several bills. Senator Wielechowski carried a bill today on taxes on oil, and all of these things need to be discussed. The House has introduced, as was mentioned earlier, a sales tax. We need to talk about all those things and see how they fit in and how we can come to a conclusion here in about 7 weeks.
All right, thank you, Senator Stevens, for starting us off. The spring revenue forecasts painted a pretty grim picture compared to the fall forecast. Senator Wielechowski, in an earlier interview, you said you expected the House budget to be $400 to $450 million in the red before considering education and deferred maintenance. The Constitutional Budget Reserve has about $2 billion in it, but that can't easily be accessed, correct?
The Constitutional Budget Reserve requires a 3/4 vote of each body. That's proven to be extremely difficult to get. And yes, we will have, at least according to current projections, if the House budget passes as it left the Finance Committee, roughly a $400 to $450 million shortfall. And that's before adding funding for education. That's before adding funding for deferred maintenance. So we've got a challenge ahead of us.
And because there's about $2 billion in the constitutional budget reserve, that vote would be even more difficult, if I'm understanding it correctly, because there should be at least that much in the CBR, correct?
Yes, our Legislative Finance Division and the Department of Revenue have told us that pretty much the bare minimum that you should let the constitutional budget reserve drop to is about $2 billion. Some say it should be somewhat higher. Some say it should be maybe a little bit less. But you need the constitutional budget reserve to balance the fluctuations that we have throughout the year with our budget. There's a complex series of transactions that occur throughout the year that we authorize to allow that to happen. But you need to take into account that you may have oil prices that drop. You may have shortfalls in revenue that you don't expect. And so you need that cushion in the constitutional budget reserve. And we're at about the bare minimum where we can be on the constitutional budget reserve. You can't take a whole lot out of it without impacting the future cash flow of the state.
All right, thank you. Senator Stevens, back to you. The state constitution requires, as we mentioned, a balanced budget. There have been cuts for a number of years now. Are there still cuts or others that you think are still available to be made?
It's really hard to find cuts. As you know, we did make some cuts. The cuts were made to the SNAP program to the employees there last year, and it just went too far, and we weren't able to do the duty of the state is to help people with food needs. And so we were able to put some money back in the fast track supplemental. But as for finding additional places to cut the budget, that's really hard and probably no big dollar amounts. Eliminate programs entirely, you could do that, but I think most folks don't want to see that happen.
Senator Wielechowski, are there any cuts that you can foresee at this point?
I would agree with Senator Stevens. I don't think there is room for significant cuts. There's always room, I think, for maybe some around the edges, but I think in the last decade or so, the budget has been cut significantly, and I just don't think there is room for significant additional cuts. And we're not seeing additional cuts proposed by the governor. We're not seeing them proposed by the House. We haven't seen them proposed in the Senate. So if there are cuts out there, we just haven't seen them.
What a dilemma right now. Senator Stevens, from your perspective, where are the biggest holes, the most urgent needs in the budget that you feel just simply must be addressed this year? What are your must-have priorities?
Well, there were two issues that our caucus was organized on, the bipartisan caucus, the Democrats and Republicans get together to form the majority here in the Senate. And there were two issues we started with. One was education, adequate education funding, and the other was retirement. We know that retirement may be an issue that'll take a couple of years to do, but hopefully we can get to the end on education here. As you know, there were two that were a little bit apart from the House and the Senate. The Senate Bill 52 puts in $1,000 in 24, $384 in 25, and then an inflation factor. The House has a $680 BSA and then increases that by $120 in 2025. So that's a total of $800. So we're a little different, but are close enough that we can keep talking about this and hopefully come to an agreement on how much we need to put into education. I as a former professor, I know as a former president of the school board, I know the problems our school boards are facing, and this is not the right way to improve the education standards and the education outcome for our students. So more money needs to go in. We'll see where the compromise between the House and the Senate actually winds up.
Senator Wielechowski, do you see it similarly?
I do. We had two priorities in our caucus, education funding and a defined benefit. Those bills have been moving through the Senate. And we have not increased the base student allocation since 2016. So it's been 6 years, going on 7 now. In that time, you've had inflation increases, significant inflation increases in recent years. We've had labor costs increase. We've had transportation costs increase. We've had fuel costs increase. You've got deferred maintenance needs that are out there. So this is something that is critical. We had 6 schools proposed to be closed in Anchorage alone. I know there's schools proposed in other parts of the state. People are seeing the dramatic impacts of failing to adequately fund education. We have got constitutional obligation to fund education, and I think we're getting perilously close to meeting that constitutional obligation.
Well, against this backdrop of these constraints, Are you still, as you have been, Senator Wielechowski, a fan of a full statutory PFD, permanent fund dividend?
Well, the math just doesn't work at this point. I wish it did. I wish we were in a different situation. I wish we had adopted some other things in recent years that could change that. But the reality is, we've got a government to run. We've got constitutional obligations for public safety. We've got constitutional obligations to keep our courts open. We've got constitutional obligations to provide education funding. We've got to keep constitutional obligations, quite frankly, to provide for the general welfare of the people, which we do via our Health and Social Services Department. So the money is simply not there. It's a basic math problem, and the money's just simply not there.
Senator,
So if I could,
yes, please, Senator
make
Stevens,
a
I wanted to
comment,
ask for your thoughts.
You know, the Senate Bill 107 is in Senate Finance right now, and that's often called 75-25, meaning that 75% of the POMV would be used for running the government, and 25% would be used for a dividend. You know, that to me, I know it depends on how it all turns out, but that could be, I think, around $1,100 to $1,400 for a PFD. But at the same time, it allows us to fund all of the things that we need to do, like education, to fund the current budget, plus the education, plus the university maintenance issues that are out there as well. So, you know, we'll see how that turns out. But at this point, that seems to be looking pretty good just for us finding a solution to this at SB 107. There are other things out there, but if we did that bill, 75-25, we would not have to really deal with additional oil taxes and that sort of thing.
Let's talk a little about potential revenue. There's a proposal for a sales tax, a statewide sales tax of 2%. This would be on top of local sales taxes ranging from anywhere from 2 or 3% up to 7% in some communities. Do you think it will have a chance of passing? Are you supportive of this concept? Senator Stevens, start us off.
Well, it's worth the discussion. I think we need to have the discussion. It's beginning in the House. That came through the Ways and Means Committee. Of course, we have not seen it yet, have not talked about it in the Senate. But the problem, having been a former mayor of my city and also the borough, I realize the problems that are faced local communities. We have many communities have a 7% sales tax. We add a couple more percent. Some are higher than that. And so you're approaching a 10% sales tax. That'll be quite a struggle for many people. And you know, if what we're talking about is just dealing with the permanent fund dividend, if people are willing to have a high sales tax in order to have a high permanent fund dividend, I mean, I'm not sure that many people are willing to do that, because what we're doing really is just taking money out of one of your pockets and putting it back in the other. So that's a concern we have. I'm also concerned about the number of people we'd have to hire to have a sales tax division here in the state. Apparently, the way it looks, we would collect the sales tax for all the communities and remit it to the various communities. So it's quite an expense and quite a large department we'd have to create. So there's a lot of issues that need to be discovered in the sales tax, and we'll see how it turns out when it comes through the House.
Senator Wielechowski, your thoughts about statewide sales tax?
Well, my preference would be to see changes to the oil tax structure first, but we need a comprehensive fiscal plan, in my opinion, and that's going to require everyone to give a little bit. And from the oil tax bill that was presented today would raise over $800 million per year. And that number may shrink through the process, but you know, the projections that we need to get a 50-50 going forward are, I've heard, range anywhere from $800 million to $1.2 billion. I've been a big supporter, as you know, of the dividend. I want as big a dividend as possible. And what I'd like to see is let's start getting what I think we need to do under our Constitution, following our constitutional obligation to get the maximum value for our resource. We need to increase or change the oil taxes. And quite frankly, it's just cutting oil tax credits for the most part, and closing an S-corp loophole gets us probably $600 million. That the governor's carbon sequestration bills get us anywhere from $300 million to the projections are up to $1.2 billion. I'm happy to have a discussion about anything else that people bring in, and anything that gets us to that point where we can all agree. And, you know, I'm not willing to say I'm not going to consider anything at this point. I'll consider anything, and I think that's where the governor was today, and I think that's where people in the legislature, many people are that we need to solve this problem. You know, the problem with just using a dividend-only solution is what happens if the stock market declines, which many people are suggesting will happen. We're a lot of talk about possibly going into a recession. If the stock market declines rapidly, that greatly depletes the earnings reserve. You know, we were in a situation not too long ago where 2009, 2010, after the market crashed, we couldn't afford to pay a dividend. And that caused the permanent fund to have to sell at a fire sale a lot of their assets. And so I think a permanent fund only solution is not going to get us to the finish line. I think there needs to be other components to this.
Mm-hmm. So, Senator Stevens, I want you to weigh in here. What are you hearing about the potential for support for an overhaul of the oil tax system that would have the potential for raising revenue faster than the carbon sequestration plan? That would take many years to implement. A reduction or a overhaul of oil taxes could be a more immediate effect. What's the reception been like?
Well, I believe it's pretty positive. You know, you're right. The carbon sequestration could be a long time in coming and may not bring in the monies we need, but we certainly want to support the governor's ability to look into that and try to find a solution, try to find some monies coming in from carbon sequestration. But you're talking about the tax structure on oil, and I think there's a lot of support for that. As you know, as Senator Wilkowski mentioned, the correcting the loophole that exists for S corporations, where prior to this they did pay a tax, income tax to the state. Now they have not been doing that. I'm talking about S corporations, so that's pretty substantial. I think it adds about $139 million to our revenue. So I think that's the easier one of the two, is to clear up that loophole that has existed. The other issue that Senator Wilkowski was talking about, reducing the oil tax credits, certainly worth looking at. It would make a big difference in our revenue, and we should be again discussing everything, but with the realization that we only have somewhere around 7 weeks to go here to solve all these problems, and we need to work quickly to get that done.
One of the critiques that we hear when there is proposals for changing the oil tax structure on the oil industry, is that it will chill investment, that it will drive producers out of the state. Is there any past evidence of that being the case when taxes have changed in past legislative sessions? Senator Wilkowski? Or Senator Stevens?
Well, we passed ACES in 2007. Alaska's Clear and Equitable Share. Governor Palin was the governor at the time, and that was a fairly significant increase in oil taxes. And we heard the complaints that this would discourage investment. In fact, investment went up to all-time highs. Jobs went up to all-time highs. When and it was because of the way that tax structure worked. You can organize your tax structure in a way to incentivize investment, to incentivize new companies, and that is exactly what we did. And when Senate Bill 21 passed in 2013, we heard all sorts of promises that this was going to create all new jobs, new investment, new production. They named it the More Alaska Production Act, and new revenue, and protect and grow the PFD, quite frankly. And I have the numbers. Production has declined. We were promised 1 million barrels a day. We're just dropped below 500,000 barrels a day. Revenue has plummeted in the state to the point where we can no longer fund our government. Oil used to fund 85% of our government. It now funds between 15 and 25% generally. Investment has been cut in half since 2014 on the North Slope, and it's gone from $877 million at Prudhoe Bay down to $220 million last year, declining just about every single year. Of course, we see what's happened to the dividend. So, the jobs, and that's the other thing, jobs have been cut more than in half since 2014. So a lot of promises were made, none of them were kept, and here we are, and in my opinion, I think the evidence is just crystal clear that it's not getting us what we were promised.
So in our final minute here, Senator Wilkowski, and then I want to end with Senate President Stevens, what is your absolute must-have in this last 7 weeks, and do you anticipate we're going to be looking at special sessions?
Well, look, we've got to get 11 votes in the Senate, 21 in the House, and the governor to sign on. What I'd like to see is I'd like to see us take this opportunity and come up with a fiscal plan.
Okay.
And we've debated these issues for years. We've debated oil taxes. We've debated the permanent fund. We know what the issues are. We just need to act. We need the political will to act.
Yes, and Senator Stevens, in about 15, 20 seconds here.
Well, I simply say that the key things to me would be to make sure that we adequately fund education and make a final decision on what the amount of the PFD is going to be. Those are the two key things I think we can expect to decide in the next few days.
Do you think that there will be a special session?
No, I don't believe that's necessary. I think we can get our work done in 121 days, and I don't think anybody wants to have a special session at all.
All right, well, thank you so much to my guest, Senate President Republican Gary Stevens of Kodiak, and Anchorage Democrat Senator Bill Wielechowski for their time this evening and for their efforts at seeking legislative consensus on a balanced state budget during fiscally challenging times. That's it for this edition of Alaska Insight. Visit our website, alaskapublic.org, for breaking news and reports from our partner stations across the state. While you're there, sign up for our free daily digest so you won't miss any of Alaska's top stories of the day. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night.